Hello, and welcome to Project 2025, A Warning. I'm Molly Jong-Fast, a writer, a podcaster, and a person you occasionally see on cable news. And today I am talking to Mary Ziegler, a UC Davis School of Law professor and the author of Roe, The History of a National Obsession. She's the go-to expert when it comes to reproductive rights, and she's also a historian. But before we start that conversation, let's get you up to speed. Last year, the influential right-wing think tank, the Heritage Foundation, unveiled Project 2025. It is a roadmap for what another Trump administration would look like. It instructs independent agencies or agencies that would have been independent under other administrations, such as the Department of Justice, to be placed under direct presidential control. This basically gives the president a lot more power than a president has ever had before. And I know right now you may be thinking that this sounds a little crazy, like something one of your friends who reads a little too much Facebook sends you. But the Heritage Foundation developed and then linked the Project 2025 mission statement right from their website. The plan is titled Mandate for Leadership 2025, the Conservative Promise. They are not trying to hide it. In fact, they go on television and brag about it. And what they brag about is a plan to reshape America into the craziest conservative dystopia possible. Heritage and their allies have called for ending no-fault divorce, ending the Affordable Care Act, additional tax breaks for corporations and the 1%, a complete ban on abortions, cuts to Social Security, the end of climate protections, cutting Medicare, defunding the FBI and Homeland Security, banning sexual orientation and gender identity education, strictly limiting contraceptives and regulating in vitro fertilization, banning pornography and imprisoning anyone who disobeys, banning Muslims from entering the country, elimination of union and worker protections, raising the retirement age, raising prescription drug prices, eliminating the Department of Education, banning African American and gender studies at all levels of education, banning books and curriculum about slavery, use of the military to break up domestic protests, ending birthright citizenship, eliminating federal agencies like the FDA, EPA, and NOAA. And despite how crazy that sounds, it's only the tip of the iceberg. Now, you may be thinking, the Heritage Foundation isn't Donald Trump. It isn't his presidential campaign or the Republican Party. But the Heritage Foundation has been the laboratory for many of the conservative policies of the last half century. But don't take my word for it. Here's Senator Marco Rubio from the state of Florida.
And it's good to see you, and thank you to Heritage for inviting us here, giving us this opportunity, and for all the scholarship that they do here that really serves as a guidepost for a lot of the public policy we choose to make.
These policies are wildly unpopular, and Trump has tried to cover up his ties to them, namely Russ Vought and John McEntee. Let's discuss these guys. Christian nationalist Russ Vought, an author of Project 2025, serves as the policy director of the Republican Party Platform Writing Committee for the RNC. You know, the organization that Trump's daughter-in-law runs that pays many of his legal fees. And you may remember right-wing dating app entrepreneur John McEntee, who was Trump's body man and nicknamed Deputy President, joined Project 2025 to write the database for who the Trump administration should hire. And Trump's own insiders say he will be a big part of the next Trump administration. But a clear sign of Trump's tether to Project 2025 is that Trump's name appears in the document 312 times. They are indeed one in the same. And if you don't take this seriously, here's Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts, and he's going to show you just how serious they are.
We are going to win. We're in the process of taking this country back. No one in the audience should be despairing. No one should be discouraged. We ought to be really encouraged by what happened yesterday. And in spite of all of the injustice, which of course friends and audience of this show, of our friend Steve know, we are going to prevail.
Well, that sounds threatening.
We are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be.
I'm starting to think that these people may actually be very serious about making this happen. Kevin Roberts also said that he saw Heritage's role as institutionalizing Trumpism, adding that the Trump administration, with the best of intentions, simply got off to a slow start. Heritage and its allies in Project 2025 believe that that slow start should never be repeated. So now we have established this is the backbone of what a second Trump term will look like. Let's bring in the brilliant Mary Ziegler, a UC Davis School of Law professor and author of Roe, The History of a National Obsession, to tell us what Project 2025 will mean for reproductive rights. So, Mary, you're one of the smartest academics I know, and you also write about law, the history of the law and abortion. We had to have this emergency YouTube series to talk about Project 2025 because it keeps me up at night. I'm hoping you could talk us through where we are in America right now with abortion that sets the stage for all of this.
Yeah, I mean, where we are right now is kind of a mess, right? I mean, there are 2 pending U.S. Supreme Court cases that we're likely to hear about anytime between this week and the end of the month. There are any number of divergent state laws. States are introducing new bans, even as they already have existing bans. We're starting to see more interest in conservative states in limiting travel for abortion. We're seeing conservative efforts to introduce a kind of backdoor federal ban on abortion through the Comstock Act that they're hoping a potential Trump administration would enforce. And we're also seeing, I think, leakage or slippage between the concepts of contraception and birth control that could have a lot of consequences too. So, I mean, big picture, the U.S. Supreme Court, when it overturned Roe v. Wade, was essentially saying, well, sure, everybody's going to lose this fundamental right, and that's kind of too bad. But on the bright side, the abortion conflict will simmer down because the real problem was Roe v. Wade. So once we, the Supreme Court, exit stage left, everyone is just going to get along better, and this conflict is not really going to exist anymore. And it turns out that that's not true, right? It turns out that not only that, but the U.S. Supreme Court has more abortion cases than ever before, not fewer. So the kind of general picture is chaos, but also I think it's not necessarily that we've hit rock bottom either. I mean, I think that since we're talking about 2025, things could get a lot more draconian at the federal level still.
Part of the plan here is this embryonic personhood. So I'm hoping that you could talk a little bit about how Heritage got involved in that and what that means in this post-Roe America.
Yeah, one of the things that most people don't understand is that embryonic personhood was sort of the reason the anti-abortion movement came into being, right? The anti-abortion movement existed before Roe v. Wade. The modern anti-abortion movement started in the 1960s as soon as states tried to reform their criminal abortion laws. And the argument that the movement made was essentially, well, you can't, have reformed abortion laws because it violates the constitutional rights of fetuses and embryos. And that argument never went away. If people want to kind of, check me on this, look at the Republican Party platform starting in the 1980s. It always called for a fetal personhood amendment. It was just that the anti-abortion movement thought it was politically impossible for a long time to get such an amendment or to get a court to say that fetuses or embryos had constitutional rights. And now, for obvious reasons, that isn't true anymore, right? I mean, it seems that some conservative judges are quite open to this idea. And so that's always been kind of the end game for the anti-abortion movement. And since the Supreme Court overturned Roe, the overturn window has shifted, and we've seen more and more conservative groups saying, yeah, we're here for fetal personhood. That's the idea. They have referred to a coalition of anti-abortion groups refers to this as the movement's new North Star. And they have quoted, for example, Abraham Lincoln saying, you can't have a nation that's half slave and half free, by which they mean you can't have a nation where abortion is legal in some places and illegal in other places. There needs to be a sort of one size solution imposed on everyone from the top down.
I mean, they went from states' rights to we have to ban this, making us think that this was never, ever, ever about states' rights.
No, yeah, it totally wasn't. I mean, the anti-abortion movement is not the pro-democracy or pro-states' rights movement. I mean, the idea that anybody believed that was the point is sort of beggar's belief a little bit.
Right. No, I agree. So Heritage has sort of mapped out a kind of roadmap for this post-Roe America, and it includes this embryonic personhood. And in this embryonic personhood is regulating IVF. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at the Heritage documents, there's no even pretend. There's just why don't we regulate IVF? Why, let's not regulate Exxon because oil companies are fine. Let's not regulate cigarettes. Let's not regulate. but we have to regulate IVF. Can you sort of make this make sense?
Well, so if you buy the argument, so I mean, there are two things going on here, right? One is that if you buy the argument that fetuses and embryos are persons, then IVF might be weird to you, right? Because you'll see anti-abortion people saying, well, we can't put children in freezers and we can't donate children for research and we can't destroy children. So once you kind of go down that road, that's part of what's going on. I think the other thing that's going on in the background is that often beliefs about personhood travel alongside beliefs about gender, sex, sort of the idea that there are God-given gender roles, that those are necessary to human flourishing. And I think there's always been a subset of people within the anti-abortion movement who are disturbed by IVF because they see it as sort of antithetical to the idea that children are only born when straight married people have sex, or that it sort of is used in ways that subvert their beliefs vis-a-vis gender and sex, right? You have lots of queer families that use IVF. You have single parents, single women who use IVF. So I think it's both about personhood, but also about this kind of constellation of beliefs that often travel alongside personhood.
From there's this like need to regulate birth control. And that's sort of another branch of this fetal personhood. So these are wildly unpopular things. It's not like abortion where you poll it and you get 65% say there shouldn't be, there should be choice. It's like 80%, 90%. Nobody wants to take away birth control. Nobody wants to take away IVF. But the part of this is birth control. So can you talk us through, and it's not just the morning after pill, which might in this idea sort of make sense because, I mean, again, it doesn't, but the idea is that maybe whereas the birth control just totally doesn't make sense at all. I mean, by this sort of fake logic. So talk us through that for a minute.
Yeah, well, I think that there are, again, two things going on. So the first thing, some people may remember back to the fight about the Obamacare contraceptive mandate.
Right.
So there were lots of conservatives at the time.
Hobby
Lobby, that it turns out that most of the things we all thought were contraceptives are actually abortifacients, right? So not just emergency contraceptives, but IUDs and the birth control pill. And ever since Hobby Lobby, really powerful anti-abortion groups like Students for Life, on which Leonard Leos sat on the board of directors, they've said, contraception is a con, right? This is the sort of marketing, right? That these things, we're being told these things are contraceptives, but they're not. And this has been a major social media campaign. So part of the pushback against contraception is a definitional thing. Like another interesting feature is that since Dobbs, several states have reformed their definitions of abortion to remove language that excludes contraceptives, right? That's created some kind of gray area. They haven't, said that contraceptives are abortifacients either. They're just leaving that to the imagination. The other thing I think that's happening is that, again, many conservatives have been uncomfortable with contraception going back some time too, viewing, separating sex and reproduction as immoral or as encouraging promiscuity or as unnatural or as contrary to their religious teachings. So we're starting too to see some conservatives mount efforts to criticize contraception, not as abortion, but just to say contraception is bad as contraception. The most obvious at the moment focus, unsurprisingly, on minors, right? So saying minors shouldn't be able to access contraception and if their parents don't want them to. We've started to see some arguments that kind of parallel ones we saw about abortion, where you're hearing them say, well, contraceptives are dangerous and they increase the risk of depression and cancer. Right. Kind of the same thing we saw with abortion. And we're seeing, I think one of the interesting things too is, a lot of kind of behind the scenes efforts to defeat right to contraceptive bills, even when conservatives are not always putting out front why they oppose contraception. They don't want right to contraception bills either.
Can you talk a little bit about this sort of Comstock Act? It's like a historical law from the 1800s that they just sort of rediscovered. So I'd love you to sort of talk us through what it is, how it is, and why the Heritage Foundation, how they discovered it and how they got so excited about it.
Yeah, so the Comstock Act was an 1873 obscenity law, and it was a really weird obscenity law. So at the time the Comstock Act passed, no one was really sure what obscenity meant. So some people thought it was like, saying swear words in front of kids. Some people thought it was porn. Some people even thought it was, displaying pictures of monsters that freak people out. Like, no one knew what obscenity meant. And so Anthony Comstock and his colleagues wanted to say, well, obscenity just means things that make people want to have sex they shouldn't have. And that, he argued, includes abortion and contraception and information about them. And the point for Comstock was not that he wanted to protect fetuses or unborn life. It was that that people knew they could have sex while using contraception or abortion, or even things that were like snake oil remedies that purported to be effective in preventing pregnancy, that they would just have more sex. So he included all of these things in this obscenity bill. It was enforced kind of sporadically, mostly against people who were like political opponents of Anthony Comstock. It was like a complete First Amendment nightmare. And then the abortion and contraception enforcement kind of fell off in the early 20th century and never rebounded. And then no one thought about it much anymore because of a combination of Roe v. Wade and this lack of enforcement and a bunch of judicial decisions from the 1930s saying you can't enforce it in a wide variety of circumstances. So how it was rediscovered was Jonathan Mitchell, who some people may have heard of. Jonathan Mitchell represented Donald Trump in his disqualification case from Colorado before the U.S. Supreme Court. He was the architect of Texas's bounty bill, SB 8. And he has this pet theory, basically, that when a Supreme Court or any court blocks a law or says it's unconstitutional, the law never goes away. It just sort of sits there like a zombie. And then if a court decision is overturned, the law springs back into life, even if no one knows it's there, even if it hasn't been enforced in hundreds of years. So he saw the Comstock Act as a potential abortion ban before the Supreme Court overturned Roe. And almost as soon as the Supreme Court overturned Roe, he and his colleague, Mark Lee Dixon, started writing ordinances saying this town will only license an abortion clinic if it complies with federal law, meaning their interpretation of the Comstock Act. So they interpret this language in the Comstock Act that refers to items or information related to abortion as a ban on mailing or shipping or putting in interstate commerce any item related to abortion. And they interpret that as a de facto ban on all abortion because they say no abortion clinic in America does abortions with pills they make in-house or medical equipment they use in-house. It's worth emphasizing this is not what I think the Comstock Act means. As a historian, I don't think that's what Congress intended it to mean. Anthony Comstock himself in 1915 said he never intended the Comstock Act to block people's access to their physicians in cases of emergency. But, no one particularly cares what I think, right? So Heritage saw Jonathan Mitchell's theory and thought, wow, that's really cool because Congress isn't going to pass an abortion ban with no exceptions from fertilization, right? That's not going to happen.
Wildly unpopular. Yeah.
And so the only way to get this is basically to rely on a Republican presidential administration, the U.S. Supreme Court, who are, of course, much, much more conservative than American voters. And that would be all you would need to get this theory to work. So that's how Heritage kind of glommed onto it and sold it to basically almost every major anti-abortion group.
Comstock himself, Anthony Comstock, was not actually anti-choice, right? Towards the end of his life, he actually was pro-choice. Is that right?
Yeah, he didn't love abortion. He didn't. My best reading of Comstock was that he just didn't care. So for Comstock, it was all about sex, right? Well, so first of all, he didn't differentiate abortion and contraception at all. If he arrested someone who just sold contraceptives, he would call them an abortionist. It was just all the same to him. And part of the reason for that is he had no idea if people were pregnant. No one in the 19th century knew if you were pregnant until late in pregnancy. No one knew if the drugs you were selling worked, and he didn't care, right? So he would call contraceptives things like incentives to sin, right? The idea being that women were having, and children, young men sometimes do, were having sex that gave him the ick. And that was really the problem. He would put, he would hold up things like contraceptives and dildos and be like, this is the same kind of problem. So to the extent he cared about this at all, it definitely isn't in the way that Heritage and Jonathan Mitchell care. And interestingly, when they say this law is an abortion ban, there's a whole lot of ellipses, right? They're taking out all the stuff about you can't mail other items for indecent or immoral use or things that are obscene, lewd, libidinous, etc. So, and interestingly, like, I don't really believe the ellipses long term, because of course these are people who have anxieties about, as you mentioned, things like IVF or contraceptives or PrEP drugs for HIV prevention. Like, I don't think we can guarantee that if the Comstock Act is brought back in this way, that it won't be applied to lots of other things beyond just abortion.
Hi. I just want to stop for 1 second. The reason we put this on YouTube for free is because we wanted to spread it to as many people as possible. It would really help us if you comment, click like, and send this to a friend or 3. Also, if you enjoyed this, subscribe to our podcast, Fast Politics, on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much. Now back to the interview. Right, and it seems like there's an interest there. Can you talk to us about the sort of larger historical place the Heritage Foundation has, and sort of why Project 2025 is a little bit of a departure?
Yeah, I mean, the Heritage Foundation has always been a conservative think tank. It's always had a position of influence, but I think what's interesting is that if you go back to recent years, Heritage hasn't been the kind of leading litigator or leading strategist of Supreme Court, moves in the anti-abortion movement or within social conservatism. It hasn't really been the main mover and shaker in terms of executive branch policy necessarily either. It's been, kind of part of this big ecosystem of conservative think tanks, but it hasn't been like a leader necessarily. But I think what's really interesting about there are 2 things about Project 2025 that make it really interesting. One is that Project 2025 is a coalition effort, right? So Heritage led this, but it got buy-in from over 100 other conservative groups. So this really reflects the best ideas that a big cohort of people on the right have had, not just Heritage. The other really interesting thing is that a lot of the people who work at Heritage now, or who wrote Project 2025, are very close to Donald Trump. And I think there's a clear understanding on the part of Heritage that getting influence in a potential second Trump administration is not just about having the smartest people in the room. It's about having the people that Donald Trump will listen to in the room. And so a lot of what you see in Project 2025 is being offered by people who worked in the first Trump administration. And I think on the theory that these are people Donald Trump is much more likely to bring back, or at least entertain, than lots of other people who are conservative. So, I mean, I take Project 2025, not like I didn't take Heritage seriously or they didn't have influence in the past, they did. But I think Project 2025 I view as being in a kind of different category for all those reasons.
Yeah, I mean, it's as if they have figured out that part of it is figuring out what you can get past, but part of it is figuring out how you can speak to Donald Trump.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's a big part of, because I think that's a huge part of it, because the anti-abortion movement before Dobbs was all about figuring out how you speak to the Supreme Court. And that's still going on. But the Heritage now, Project 2025, you can read it as like, how do you find in the Venn diagram the thing that will convince Donald Trump and Brett Kavanaugh at the same time, right? That's like the sweet spot right now.
And Donald Trump and Brett Kavanaugh, they have the court.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a 3-3-3 court. It's not even really a 5-4 court. It's really a 6-3 court.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think the difference is that there's a 3-3-3 court in the sense of like appearances, right? Like if you just say to Brett Kavanaugh, we're going to burn it all down, he doesn't want to say that that's what he's doing, even if that's what he's doing. And that's definitely true of John Roberts. And it's also true of Amy Coney Barrett. Like during the argument about emergency abortions, there's a moment when Amy Coney Barrett got like visibly mad at the attorney for Idaho because she's like, you just contradicted yourself. So there are 3 of them who I think are, care about like their public image, and 3 of them who don't. And then there are the 3 liberals, right? So I think in the Venn diagram, it's not necessarily that there are 6 votes, I think, for limiting access to reproductive healthcare dramatically more, but there are 3 where you still sort of have to play your cards right. Like they're going to lose one of the Supreme Court cases this term, conservatives, because the people who brought the case don't have standing. And so there's a cohort of people on the court who are like, well, sure, I'd love to side with you, but you don't have standing. Sorry, so
that's the methylpristone case.
Exactly. And so I think what you're seeing essentially, if you're imagining the Venn diagram, is like, how do you get the people who are still where there are bridges too far in terms of just being a clown and not making respectable legal arguments? You have to make enough of an argument that they can, go to bed at night. And then you also have to convince Donald Trump that's what Project 2025 is. I mean, I think almost all the ideas in that document are intended to be appealing to those audiences. And, it's worth emphasizing too, like if Donald Trump gets elected, we may not have to think a whole lot longer about Brett Kavanaugh or John Roberts in other words, the Supreme Court could move further to the right? It's not necessarily the case that it's going to remain this way indefinitely.
Well, what I think about so much is one of the things that Trump is famous for having never done is tried to appeal to the middle, right? So usually a president gets in office, gives a speech that's like, you didn't vote for me, but I'm still going to be your president. Trump was like, American carnage,
he can't run for re-election, right?
Right.
So, if you imagine how he sounded the first time when he could run for re-election, it's like this time, what incentive does he have to appeal to people in the middle, right? He can't run again anyway.
And maybe he won't because he will just decide to stay, which is something that actually does keep me up at night. But this idea with 2025 and the Heritage Foundation, it seems to me that there was a sea change in the organization, and it happened sometime in the tenure of Donald Trump. Because I used to go to CPAC, and they had a president of the organization who was an elderly Black woman, and she said a lot of stuff that was, not what I believed, but didn't seem all that crazy. And it was like that sort of trying to sell conservatism to normal people. And when you look at this document, when you look at this tact, it's like they've just completely stopped worrying about the court of public opinion and have just realized that they can push the law as far right as they want. I mean, is that historically accurate?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think they were Kay James, who was the
Kay James,
she was, and she was a veteran anti-abortion activist, but she was always sort of like a bridge figure. I remember hearing her talk about George Floyd's murder, right? And kind of where the country needed to go from that. And it was very kind of run of the mill, like America is already a great country and there's not really a deep problem with racism. There are individual bad actors, but it was, it was not it was fairly familiar stuff. I think that a lot of the people, so there's a lot of symbiosis between the first Trump administration and Heritage, and that's part of what you see. So Roger Severino is a major kind of bridge figure. Gene Hamilton, who wrote parts of Project 2025, is a big bridge figure. So I think some of it was that Heritage literally absorbed a lot of people from the Trump administration. And then I think there was also Heritage's transformation just reflecting a broader transformation to the GOP, which was, of course, remade in Donald Trump's image. And then there was, I think, a realization within Heritage and the GOP that the way to exercise power in America on the right was to please Donald Trump. And that if you please Donald Trump, and Donald Trump was able to get elected because people like his personality, or there's almost a cult of personality, right? That you wouldn't have to actually sell your substantive policies. In the case of abortion, I think Trump's strategy has been more to just not say what his policies are. I mean, my favorite, I don't know, someone should have a counter, but he keeps saying he's going to answer questions about the Comstock Act, and issue a policy in a certain number of weeks. And of course, at this point now, months have gone by and we have yet to hear a policy. So I think he's largely just operated by confusing people and not answering the question. But Heritage, I think, understands that if you please Donald Trump, you essentially can do what you want in terms of policy. So there's no need, in other words, to appeal to voters if you have influence with Trump and influence with the Supreme Court.
That seems totally right to me. The fact that when you read these documents, they've completely given up trying to win hearts and minds, which I think is a bold strategy for a political party that, at least for now, still needs to win elections. I mean, right, we're in this polling environment right now where you're seeing these crazy polls which say things like Hispanics don't think that Donald Trump, there's a percentage of young Latino voters who do not believe that Donald Trump is conservative. I mean, there's all sorts of, information bubble problems here, but this fundamental lack of interest in winning over voters, I mean, has this ever worked for a political party?
I mean, it can, right? I mean, I think because of a combination, like you said, of information bubbles, but also because a lot of what Republicans are relying on now are sort of structural things that Donald Trump,
Right.
neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden can control, right? So if people like don't like inflation, they may vote for Donald Trump just because he's not currently the president, right?
Right.
And I think there's a lot of like two-track campaigning where you essentially have Heritage saying to the base, here's what Donald Trump's going to do. And then Donald Trump saying completely different things Donald Trump is going to do. And then people on social media saying Donald Trump isn't going to, you know, maybe saying things that are not any of those things or somewhere in between. So I think that there's a lot of confusion, and that confusion helps the GOP, because I don't think the message Heritage is sending is the message all voters are receiving, right? I mean, the most kind of revealing quote about this was when Jonathan Mitchell was talking to the New York Times, and he said, you know, it's better if, you know, right to lifers don't talk about this at all until after the election. And I hope Donald Trump doesn't know what the Comstock Act is, because I don't want him to run his mouth, right? I think that's kind of the strategy, is like that, you know, you and I are not having this conversation, and neither is anyone else. And that Project 2025 is out there for the base to say, you know, hey, don't worry if Donald Trump isn't saying all the things you want, because he knows, you know, he knows what we need, and he's going to do it for us when the moment arrives. But we all have to keep it on the down low until like, that's, I think, a lot of what you're seeing.
So one of the things that when in 2016, there were a lot of Cassandras like myself who said, you know, Donald Trump could overturn Roe v. Wade. And even when SB 8 came out in Texas, I think you and I may have even had this conversation. You know, we were both like, this looks like the path to overturning Roe. And even when the Supreme Court was just looking at it before the decision came out, there were still people up until the Dobbs draft was leaked. And even after that, you know, who said, oh, it's never going to happen. So I'm wondering if you could speak to the denial, which both helped sell Project 2025 and also helped America sort of sleepwalk into the Supreme Court decision.
So people understood that overruling Roe v. Wade would be really unpopular, and it would damage the Supreme Court as an institution. And so I think a lot of people just didn't believe the Supreme Court would ever pull the trigger. And what they didn't realize was that the Supreme Court had changed in fundamental ways, right? Like Samuel Alito, like, relishes the opportunity to do things that are unpopular. That's not a problem for him. It's sort of a sign that he's doing something correctly. I think there's also been a lot of complacency based on where people live. I think since Roe has been overturned, the reality on the ground has not changed that dramatically for people in states that have passed ballot initiatives or people in states that have progressive governments. And I think, again, people are sleepwalking into this election because they believe that Donald Trump would not want to, for example, impose a backdoor national ban because it would be unpopular, much as they believe the Supreme Court wouldn't want to overturn Roe because it would be unpopular. And because I think they have a hard time believing that this could affect them, right? Like the stories they've been hearing for a long time are, oh, well, these bans are affecting people in the South, and they're affecting low-income people of color, and they're essentially affecting people not like me. If you're, you know, a college student, if you have money, if you're middle class, upper class, white, you know, maybe someone, a person of color living in a state with a ballot initiative, even a person voting on a ballot initiative, right? You may feel like none of this has anything to do with you, or you may even be underestimating how bad it would be if it did happen to you. But I think that's a big part of it. And it's more surprising, obviously, with Donald Trump in a way, right? Because it's not, people should be familiar with Donald Trump based on having had him in the White House for 4 years. But I do think that people underestimate the willingness of these people in power to do the unpopular thing, even when there's lots of evidence that that's precisely what they're going to do.
Such an important and strange point. I mean, I think it's right. I think that's absolutely what the situation we find ourselves in. If Heritage is able to enact this, you would even see, it wouldn't just be abortion, right? It would be like, I mean, you wouldn't be able to get your birth control pills in the mail.
Yeah, you know, it's sort of unclear, right? So the first thing to be clear about with abortion is it would be bananas vis-a-vis abortion. So one thing to know about the Comstock Act, there's like no exceptions in the Comstock Act. So if you interpret it as an abortion ban the way conservatives do, there's no life exception There's no
Right.
health exception. There's no rape and incest exception. Another thing, if you interpret this the way conservatives do, it applies to women, right? There's no exemption. It's like anyone who receives or mails anything, period. So it would be much broader than any ban on the books in any state. Birth control pills are kind of complicated. I mean, you definitely will see some conservatives pushing for that. The tricky thing is that you have to knowingly mail things. So in other words, you have to be knowingly doing something vis-a-vis abortion. So I think you would imagine you'd get progressives pushing back if this was the law that, like, even if you think birth control could be an abortifacient, do you like knowingly do, like, are you knowingly doing an abortion? That would be, I think that would get messy, but you would see people coming after that. And I think potentially after IVF, and definitely after things that would affect LGBTQ people, drugs used for gender affirming care, definitely drugs used for HIV prophylaxis. So it wouldn't stop with abortion. And it wouldn't have, of course, it would affect people who have wanted pregnancies too, because it would affect drugs that are used in miscarriage and stillbirth management as well as abortion.
Right. I mean, that is, and it would also affect things like mailing morning after pills. I mean, with this document, it's more expansive, but some of what these conservatives have done with these bans is they haven't spelled it out in the hopes that it will intimidate doctors from doing things. Can you talk about that? Because that's a sort of interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of state bans, and I mean, the Comstock Act's pretty ambiguous too. Like, if you read it, it uses the word abortion, but it doesn't define it. And we're seeing this play out now in states like Texas and Florida, where physicians are saying, well, what happens if somebody has, somebody's membranes rupture prematurely during pregnancy, or if they have an ectopic pregnancy, or if they have a molar pregnancy, or if they have sepsis, like, when can I intervene? And essentially the dynamic in Texas encapsulates a lot of what you're seeing, where the Texas Supreme Court just yesterday rejected the claim made by a bunch of patients who were arguing that Texas law either had to allow certain emergency abortions or it was unconstitutional. They rejected that claim. And essentially their takeaway was, it's the doctor's fault, right? This law is amazing. It's reasonable. It makes lots of sense. And the doctors are just being weenies. And then they pointed the finger at the Texas Medical Board. And the Texas Medical Board's like, okay, our guidance is that we're going to rehash the law with some additional reporting requirements. And we can't do any more than that because we're not prosecutors. So we need more guidance from the Texas Supreme Court. And of course, so the upshot is that no one knows what's going on. Like, no one is providing anyone with guidance because everyone is looking to blame somebody else. And what happens when there's that much of a gray area is that physicians just aren't willing to take the risk, because not only do you have all of this legal ambiguity, in many states like Texas, you also have much more draconian penalties than the ones that were even in place before Roe. Like, Texas imposes a penalty of up to life in prison, right? So a lot of physicians, if they don't know what they can do, are unwilling essentially to do anything because it's not worth them to lose their licenses and go to prison for the rest of their lives, which is why I think we're seeing a lot of patients being denied care, and also some physicians leaving jurisdictions with laws like this because they feel like they're in a no-win situation.
It helps them to make as much gray area as possible because the chilling effect it's a feature, not a bug, right?
Mm-hmm, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think that's totally right.
Is there a world in which we can come back from the place we are now? Give us something a little hopeful.
Well, I mean, I think what's hopeful is that American voters on this have been what we kind of would have expected American voters to be from the beginning, which is that American voters may not be as supportive of abortion rights as, the most ardent feminist is, but they're pretty supportive of abortion rights. And when you actually let them make the decision and the rules are fair, they tend to come up with pretty humane, equitable solutions. Not perfect, but, so in other words, I think if you had asked me before Dobbs, I would have told you that there are a lot of people who are not humane or just or fair about thinking about reproductive health care. And every time there's been a kind of up and down vote on a ballot initiative, it's gone the way of people doing the right thing most of the time. We've seen polling to back that, like even the very week that Louisiana introduced this law, making drugs like mifepristone and misoprostol controlled substances that could be surveyed and tracked. Like a few weeks before that, the New Orleans Times-Picayune did a poll saying most Louisianans think abortion should be legal until 15 weeks, right? So I think what's hopeful essentially is that people already get it, right? People already see that criminalizing abortion is not helping with infant mortality. It isn't a particularly great way to show you value life in the womb. It isn't helping women. It isn't helping pregnant people. Like, there's not really a benefit, right? So I think that the question then is really, and I've always seen this as, if you care about reproductive rights issues, you also have to see them as democracy issues, because often, to the extent voters are the ones deciding, it isn't as bleak. It isn't as bleak, but often, and this is what Project 2025 is banking on, it's that voters won't get to decide, right? Or maybe at all, maybe on specific issues, or maybe that they'll be misinformed. So that's both depressing, but hopefully also optimistic, because there's things voters can do, and voters are inclined to do the right thing already.
Thank you, Mary. This was so great. Really appreciate you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching this episode. We made this series so that you can educate others in your life about the very real threat to America that Trump's second term would pose. Project 2025 will remake the federal government, and it's really important that you share this with a friend. Click like on the video and comment so it spreads to more people on YouTube. If you want more interviews like this, subscribe to Fast Politics on your favorite podcast app. Thanks for watching.